Eleanor had always found comfort in the rhythm of her days. The mornings in Bath were crisp, the light creeping slowly across the tall windows of their sandstone townhouse. She would rise early, make a pot of Earl Grey, and hum quietly as she arranged the breakfast table. Charles liked his toast slightly burnt, with marmalade, and his coffee black. For 20 years, she'd prepared it that way without fail. Their marriage was quiet, functional. Charles worked as a senior consultant for a firm in London, often traveling to meet clients in Manchester, Liverpool, or Bristol. Eleanor had long since given up asking for details. He always had just enough information to make it believable. Just enough eye contact to settle doubt. She convinced herself that this was trust. Every time he returned from his business trips, he brought her something. A scarf, a chocolate truffle, once even a hardback novel with a personal note on the inside cover. To my Eleanor, who keeps everything in balance. She remembered that line well, because she had framed it in her mind as proof that he cared. But lately, the smell of his cologne lingered in a way that didn't belong to him. Subtle, almost hidden beneath the surface. Once, she found a long strand of blonde hair on the passenger seat of his car. She told herself it could have been anyone's. A colleague. A waitress. Even the dog groomer. Still, something inside her began to stir. A quiet voice, one that had been silent for too long, whispering truths she wasn't ready to hear. The days stretched on as usual. Eleanor went to her book club on Thursdays, baked with her sister on Sundays, and smiled at Charles when he returned home late on Monday nights. But now, the routine felt like a stage play. She knew her lines. He knew his. And then came the moment that shifted everything. It wasn't dramatic. It was barely a moment at all. Just an email. She had sat down at the desk to send a birthday card online to her cousin in Devon. Charles had forgotten to log out of his account. There it was. A thread of messages with someone named Miranda. The subject line read, "Miss last night already." Eleanor didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just stared at the screen, her teacup going cold in her hand. Her heart didn't pound, and her stomach didn't sink. Instead, it was something else. A kind of stillness. A knowing. She read through each message slowly, letting the words settle in. There was no room left for excuses now. No margin for fantasy. This wasn't business. This wasn't work. This was betrayal, plain as day. She stood up, walked to the bathroom, and looked at herself in the mirror. Her reflection didn't flinch. She looked exactly the same, and yet everything had changed. And for the first time in years, Eleanor felt awake. The following days unfolded with eerie calm. Eleanor said nothing. She moved through the house as though nothing had happened, folding Charles' shirts with the same neat care, watering the plants, and polishing the brass doorknobs that had dulled with spring dust. But within her, the silence grew louder. Charles continued with his routines. He left early, returned late, and offered those usual, half-hearted kisses on her cheek. On Friday, he handed her a paper bag with lemon tarts from a bakery in Bristol. Eleanor smiled and thanked him, placing the bag neatly on the kitchen counter before slipping upstairs. She wasn't angry. Not yet. What she felt was sharper than anger. It was clarity. She saw everything for what it was. Their marriage was no longer built on love. It was scaffolding, hollow beams holding up the illusion of something whole. Eleanor began to notice the finer details. The nervous flutter in his voice when he mentioned meetings that never showed up on his calendar. The scent of unfamiliar perfume on the collar of his blazer. A hotel receipt for two, buried at the bottom of the laundry basket, crumpled with a lipstick mark across the edge. She began to play along, curious to see how far he would go. She asked how the Leeds conference had gone, and he launched into a clumsy tale about delayed trains and bad coffee. She listened with wide eyes and a soft nod, matching his lie with a performance of her own. That weekend, she told him she would be staying at her sister's house in the countryside for a few nights. Charles barely looked up from his phone and replied, "Enjoy yourself, darling." His voice was casual, careless. Eleanor studied him for a moment. There was no trace of guilt. She didn't go to her sister's. She booked herself a quiet room at a guest house near the coast, where the sea air washed over her like a kind of truth. There, she let herself breathe. She walked along the cliffs in silence, feeling the breeze tug gently at her coat, and thought about the girl she had once been. The Eleanor who had loved to paint, who read poetry aloud, who danced barefoot in the rain. That version of herself had been locked away, tucked behind obligations and folded linens. She missed that woman. She wanted her back. At night, she opened her journal and started to write. Not just thoughts, but plans. Steps. What she would do next. How she would take back her name, her space, her voice. It wasn't revenge she was after. It was something far simpler. Freedom. When Eleanor returned to Bath 3 days later, she stood outside her own front door for a full minute before unlocking it. The brass knocker gleamed in the morning light, freshly polished. A bouquet of tulips sat on the doorstep, no note attached. Charles was trying, in his way, though she wasn't sure if it was guilt or habit that moved him. The hallway smelled of his aftershave. Familiar, yet distant. Eleanor walked through the house slowly, noticing every detail as if seeing it for the first time. The cushions had been rearranged. A different mug sat on the drying rack. There were 2 empty wine glasses in the sink. Charles was at work. She knew he wouldn't be home until late. She poured herself a cup of tea, sat on the edge of the sofa, and looked around the room that had once felt like theirs. Now, it felt like a showroom. Decorated. Maintained. Soulless. That evening, when Charles returned, he greeted her with exaggerated cheer. "Darling. You're back. How was your sister's?" Eleanor stood calmly by the stove, stirring a pan of soup. "Peaceful," she replied. He kissed her cheek lightly. His eyes darted towards the guest room door, where his gym bag was tucked half open. Eleanor didn't mention it. She had no need to. Over dinner, he spoke about work, traffic, the upcoming client meeting in Glasgow. She asked thoughtful questions, all the while observing him. The way he scratched behind his ear when he lied. The way his eyes avoided hers when he mentioned travel. He was a man caught in his own performance, too confident to notice the audience had changed. Later that night, when he had fallen asleep on the sofa with the television still glowing, Eleanor opened his laptop. She didn't need to search far. The passwords were the same. His messages were organized. And there, in a folder marked Events, she found pictures. Photos of Charles smiling beside Miranda. A weekend trip to a cottage. Her arms wrapped around him. Matching robes. Eleanor's breath caught, not from pain, but from the surreal clarity of it all. She looked at the images as if watching a stranger's life. And perhaps she was. This man beside her, this man she had once trusted with everything, was now someone she no longer recognized. Not because he had changed, but because she had finally removed the veil she had worn for too long. She closed the laptop quietly, stood up, and took a slow walk around the house. She ran her fingers along the bookshelves they'd built together, glanced at the framed photographs, the anniversary gifts, the worn rug beneath the table. She was surrounded by memories she could no longer claim. It was no longer her home. She had become a guest in her own life. The next morning, Eleanor woke up early. The sky above Bath was heavy with clouds, casting the town in shades of grey. She pulled on a knitted jumper, tied her hair back neatly, and made her way downstairs. Charles was still asleep, sprawled across the bed like a man without worries. She opened the side drawer of her desk, pulling out an old leather notebook. It had once been filled with grocery lists, sewing measurements, and half-finished poems. Now, it would become her roadmap. Eleanor began writing, not with trembling hands, but with quiet determination. The first line read, "Step 1, speak to a solicitor." She knew she couldn't confront Charles just yet. Not until everything was in place. Not until she was ready to leave without looking back. She had watched other women crumble, shout, and beg in the face of betrayal. But she would not let herself fall apart. She started small. She found a family law firm discreetly tucked away on George Street. She made the appointment under a false name, her voice calm as she spoke to the receptionist. She set the date for the following Wednesday, just after Charles's supposed conference in Glasgow. Next, she visited the bank. The young clerk barely raised an eyebrow as she opened a private account in her name. Her hands were steady as she transferred a portion of her savings, carefully enough that Charles wouldn't notice. Not yet. Back at home, Eleanor resumed her daily performance. She smiled, cooked his favorite pasta, folded the laundry, and laughed politely at his tired stories. Each night, she sat beside him on the sofa, his head resting on her lap as he scrolled through his phone, unaware that her mind was somewhere far beyond the room. When Charles announced his next trip, this time to a workshop in Cardiff, Eleanor helped him pack. "You always fold my shirts better than I do," he said, grinning. She smiled sweetly and handed him his suitcase. "Because I've had 20 years of practice," she replied, her voice like silk. The night he left, Eleanor didn't sleep. She stayed up, walking from room to room, mentally noting what she would take and what she would leave behind. She didn't want the expensive china or the velvet curtains. She wanted her sketchbooks. Her photographs from university. The wooden jewelry box her father gave her at 18. She wasn't planning an escape. She was building a future. And so, in the quiet hours of dawn, as the streets outside remained still, Eleanor packed a small suitcase and slid it under the bed. Her silence was no longer passive. It was the armor she wore until the time was right. Charles had been gone for 2 nights. Eleanor received the usual check-in texts, short, hollow messages that tried to sound thoughtful. "Just finished at the workshop. Missing your cooking." She read them without expression, deleting them as soon as they arrived. The house felt different. Lighter. As though Charles had carried the weight of deception with him, and now she could finally breathe. Eleanor moved through the rooms with a new kind of grace, reclaiming small spaces. She lit candles again. Played classical music while she cooked. Opened the windows and let the wind mess the curtains. She spent her afternoon sorting through drawers. There were old receipts, forgotten postcards, a theater ticket stub from a play Charles once pretended to enjoy. Beneath it all, she found a photograph from the early years, both of them smiling on a cliffside walk, arms around each other. A different time. A different man. That night, she took the photo and placed it in a box along with other keepsakes that no longer sparked anything in her heart. The box would stay behind. On Wednesday, Eleanor put on a soft navy coat and walked through the streets of Bath with a calmness that seemed to slow time. She stepped into the solicitor's office, where a woman named Catherine greeted her with quiet professionalism. They sat in a small room, the windows open just slightly, the air smelling faintly of ink and lemon oil. Eleanor explained her situation plainly. No tears. No drama. Catherine listened carefully and asked the right questions. Within 45 minutes, everything had been laid out, a legal pathway, a plan of action, protections for her savings, and a strategy for departure. When she walked out of the office, Eleanor did not look back. She stopped at a local cafe and ordered an almond croissant and a black coffee, sitting outside to watch the world move around her. The breeze was gentle. The people hurried past in suits and coats and long strides. But she stayed still, her thoughts finally quiet. That evening, back at home, she began to prepare. She printed copies of important documents, birth certificates, financial papers, her will. She packed a second small bag, this one with necessities, clothes, a sketchbook, chargers, her favorite mug. Every movement was precise, thoughtful. Then, just after midnight, the front door creaked open. Charles had returned. Eleanor stayed in bed, her breathing steady, her eyes closed. She heard him set his suitcase down, take off his shoes, and move about the house as if everything was normal. But everything had changed. The home no longer welcomed him. Its walls no longer kept his secrets safe. And Eleanor, lying silently in the dark, was no longer his. The morning light seeped through the curtains slowly. Eleanor was already dressed when Charles shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He looked surprised to see her awake, a fresh blouse tucked into tailored trousers, her hair swept back in a quiet elegance he hadn't noticed in years. Up early, he mumbled, reaching for the kettle. Eleanor smiled faintly. Couldn't sleep. He leaned against the counter, watching her move about the kitchen with calm precision. There was something different about her today. Not cold, not distant, just still. As if the chaos around her no longer touched her. He talked aimlessly, updating her on the workshop, the train delay, a new client. She listened, nodding softly, her hands steady as she sliced an apple. Her silence was not the silence of anger or sadness. It was something else. Measured. Final. After breakfast, Charles went upstairs to shower. Eleanor stayed in the kitchen, wiping the table clean and setting a folded piece of paper by the teapot. She took one last look around the room. The photos on the wall. The apron still hanging by the door. The clock ticking rhythmically above the window. This space had held her life, her routines, her disappointments. Now it would hold only the echo of her absence. She picked up her bags, only two, and walked out the door without slamming it. Outside, the morning was bright. The streets of Bath carried on as usual. She walked briskly to the car she'd hired, a black cab waiting quietly by the curb. The driver greeted her with a polite nod and loaded her things without question. Inside the cab, Eleanor sat straight, her hands resting in her lap. She did not look back. Back in the house, the silence lingered until Charles came downstairs. He called her name once, twice. No reply. He spotted the folded paper. His name was written on the front in her handwriting. Inside, the letter was brief. Charles. You once asked what I'd do if I ever stopped pretending. Now you know. Please do not contact me. Everything has been arranged. Eleanor. He read it twice, then a third time, each word slicing through the lies he had built. And just like that, she was gone. Not out of rage, but out of resolution. The guest house sat on the edge of Cornwall, a whitewashed cottage tucked behind wild hedgerows, overlooking the sea. Eleanor arrived just before dusk, her bags light, her steps sure. The innkeeper, a quiet woman named June, showed her to a simple room on the top floor. The walls were pale cream, the bedspread hand-stitched, and the window opened wide to the sound of waves. She closed the door behind her and stood still for a moment. The silence was different here. Not empty. Peaceful. Whole. Eleanor unpacked slowly, placing her books on the windowsill, her sketchbook beside the lamp, her clothes neatly in the oak wardrobe. No one else's belongings shared the space. No clutter. No secrets. Just her. That night, she sat on the bed, wrapped in a wool blanket, a cup of tea in hand. The wind outside howled gently across the cliffs, and the stars shone through the clear glass. She hadn't cried, not even once. There was nothing to mourn. She hadn't lost something. She had reclaimed it. In the days that followed, Eleanor began to remember who she used to be. She visited the tiny art supply shop in the village and bought a fresh set of watercolors. She spent her afternoons painting by the shore, her hands stained with color, her mind free of worry. Locals waved to her as they passed, but no one asked too many questions. She liked it that way. She wrote in her journal every evening, her thoughts no longer twisted around someone else's needs. She made her own meals. She read until late. She let the days unfold without permission or apology. For the first time in years, Eleanor didn't feel like she was disappearing. She was becoming visible to herself again. On Sunday morning, she walked to the small post office near the chapel and posted a letter to her solicitor. It was sealed and final. The house in Bath would be sold. The accounts had been closed. The papers were ready. There would be no courtroom. No arguments. No farewell. Only the gentle closing of a chapter that had gone on too long. And as Eleanor stood by the sea that evening, hair whipping around her face, her sketchbook tucked under one arm, she smiled. Not because she was finished, but because, for the first time in decades, she had finally begun. The air was crisp and clean that morning, the kind that hinted summer was fading into early autumn. Eleanor stood outside the gallery, her paintings framed and arranged with quiet care behind the glass. The little exhibition space was modest, tucked between a bakery and a bookstore, but to her, it felt like a cathedral. It had taken weeks of quiet work, of relearning how to trust her hands, how to let the brush speak what she never had the words for. Each canvas told a story. Not of heartbreak. Not of anger. But of becoming. June had been the one to suggest the show. People should see what you've got in you, she had said one evening over a pot of tea. It's all there, Eleanor. You just needed a place to let it out. And now here it was. Her work. Her name on the window in neat letters. Eleanor Marlowe. She stepped inside as the first visitors arrived, locals mostly, and curious tourists drawn in by the sea-themed pieces and the warmth of the space. They asked about her colors, her strokes, the way she captured the light over the cliffs. Not once did anyone ask if she was married. Or where she had come from. She was no longer someone's wife, someone's daughter-in-law, someone's shadow. She was herself. At midday, she took a break and wandered down to the beach. The tide was low. Children ran laughing in the distance, and dogs chased sticks along the surf. She sat on a flat rock and pulled out her notebook. She wrote down a single line, "You don't owe anyone the pieces you gave away just to be loved." It wasn't a message to Charles. It wasn't even for Miranda. It was for herself. For the woman who had stayed too long in silence. For the woman who used to apologize for taking up space. That woman was gone. She walked back to the gallery in the golden light of the afternoon, her hair tousled by the sea breeze, her feet sandy but sure. When she unlocked the door and stepped back inside, she did not lower her gaze. She stood tall, smiled freely, and welcomed the world in.